So again, welcome to the Roundtable discussion. My name is Crina Viju-Miljusevic, and I am the director of the Institute of European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at Caltech University, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's Roundtable. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Caltech University is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. In doing so, we acknowledge that we have a responsibility to the Algonquin people and the responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. February 24th, 2022 was a day of sorrow and shock for many of us. It was the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is the day 7 of the conflict, and it is still unclear how, when, in what conditions the war will end, and what will be its outcomes. I think what is clear is that human lives are lost, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian people are displaced, Ukrainian cities and infrastructure are destroyed, thousands of Russian people are arrested as they protest against the war. It is clear that we are at the beginning of a security crisis, humanitarian crisis, economic crisis. Even though we might not be able to answer many of the questions, we have with us today 4 scholars, experts on the region, which will assess the implications of Russia's war from various perspectives, including the response of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people with Dr. Milana Nikolko, Russian domestic policy with Dr. Paul Goode, Europe's role and response with Dr. Joan DeBardeleben, and lessons learned from the 2008 Russian-Georgian war with Dr. David Sichinava. Before I'm introducing our first speaker, I would like to mention that you could ask your questions through the Q&A. So please pose your questions during the discussion, and I'll do my best to pose as many as possible once our speakers finalize their introductory remarks. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Milana Nikolko, who is an adjunct professor at the Institute of European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at Caltech University. From 2005 to 2014, Dr. Nikolko was an associate professor of political science at V. Vernadsky Taurida National University in Ukraine. In 2008, she was appointed as a visiting professor at Political Science Department, Valdosta State University in the US. She has published extensively on topics of Ukraine, national building process, mediation of gray zone conflicts, case Ukraine, political narratives of victimization among ethnic minorities, migrants, and diaspora groups. So Milana, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Crina. I will try to share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. All right, colleagues, without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. I have 11 minutes, and I do have multiple sources of information which we are trying to combine in this presentation. Information renewed on an hour basis, on a minutes basis, and sometimes it's really hard to put my emotions aside and focus and continue to monitor situation and possibly thinking of scenarios. So let's start with the timeline. 2021-2022, incredibly important to understand that this conflict didn't start in February. We see the accumulation of Russian troops on Ukrainian borders in spring 2021, which actually continue with troop drills, army exercise, conducted by Russia through the summer, in particular during the fall and beginning of 2022. But on the Ukrainian side, we also can see that we have some kind of response. So during the summer 2021, there were military exercise on Ukrainian side. In September 2021, Ukrainian government announced that they're planning to buy more Turkish drones, which the original contract started in 2019. In September 2021, Ukraine and NATO conducted NATO Black Sea drills together, and on October 27, Ukrainian army actually fired a missile of Turkish drone over the cross line with the LNR, and they effectively attacked the military construction on the site, which probably Russian reaction on this particular exercise was outrageous. And we'll see that from November 2021, Russia present security demands, including the NATO pullback troops and weaponry from Eastern Europe and bar Ukraine from ever joining the NATO. So we see the escalation started and formalized in November 2021. In December 2021, Russia presents security demands, formalized them and direct them precisely to the NATO and United States. On January 2024, NATO puts forces on standby and reinforced Eastern Europe with more ships and fighter jets, particularly closer to the border of Ukraine and countries bordered with Russia. On January 26, Washington responded to Russian security demands, repeating the commitment to NATO open door policy. And we know that in February 2022, amid growing Western fears, Russia could attack the United States. They'll also deploy more troops, and NATO members also deploy more troops in Poland, in Romania. On February 21st, in a TV address, Putin said Ukraine is an integral part of so-called Russian history, of integral development of the region. So his geopolitical vision was projected over this integral, in his mind, territory of Russia. And direct apply in re-engagement communication with so-called LNR and DNR, which ended up in February 24th when Russia backed separatist leaders, and they provide with a full cover in terms of the so-called peace operation in the territory of LNR and DNR. On February 24th, Putin authorized special military operation, which corresponded to the simultaneous missile and artillery attacks striking major Ukrainian cities, including Kiev. The most recent situation and most disturbing situation could be found in the south part of Ukraine. Yesterday, Russian media announced that they now control Energodar. This is, you can see on your left map, moved over Zaporizhia. What is Energodar? It's the satellite city of Zaporizhzhia nuclear station. What we know about Zaporizhzhia nuclear station for the last few days, Zaporizhzhia nuclear station is not a part of Ukrainian energy system anymore. So all of the 6 nuclear blocks were shut down. Out of 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine, 6 are out right now. And this situation remains unclear who actually control Energodar, but at least nuclear threat is not an issue anymore, particularly for this Zaporizhzhia nuclear station. Anticipation of the further move on the south, it's a Russian movement towards Odessa. If you again look at the map, Odessa and Kherson, Odessa, one of the major cities and major port in the Black Sea, Ukrainian port, with 1.2 million people living in the Odessa suburbs. It's definitely a major threat for Ukrainian independence. Another harsh attack is ongoing right now on another Ukrainian city in east. It's Kharkiv. Was bombarded for last 3 days, and we're talking about a massive cover of civilian buildings and attack on civilian buildings. On last night, only last night, 22 people were killed in the center of the Kharkiv civilians. When we're talking about impact of humanitarian catastrophe, which appears right now in in Ukraine. We can talk about approximately 4 million people already left the native city, and they're moving towards the western part of Ukraine. Around 680,000 already crossed the border with Western Ukrainian neighbors, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia. Around 130,000 people flee to Russia. And again, the most recent information from Emergency Service of Ukraine, about 2,000 civilians who already become victims of this conflict. So my question is, how and why Ukraine has become an existential threat to Russia? I try to put aside the speculation about the madman theory in terms of them considering the rationale which Putin has behind all of this, behind this aggression towards Ukraine. So I've moved forward with my theory about why and how Ukraine became the existential threat, the threat which quite often called in Russian propagandist media or Russian journalists as Ukraine called as anti-Russia, something what is threatening the existence of Russia itself. So we definitely can see the dynamic which established in 2004 this perception of Ukrainian revolution by Russian leader Vladimir Putin, when he first been denied, then trying to influence Ukrainian political system and continue to do so by changing Russian geopolitical strategies towards the region from soft power and engaging more and more harsh power. And of course, conflict and war in Georgia in 2008 was definitely one of the major development in terms of changing strategies of the neighboring politics of Russia. And 2014, direct engagement of pro-Russian forces in Euromaidan in support of Yanukovych, later translated in active engagement of Russian troops in annexation of Crimea and conflict in eastern Ukraine. So when Vladimir Zelensky came to office in 2019, it was mixed expectation. Again, I based my information on the different sources from Russian political analysts and observations about who Zelensky and how he's going to maintain relations with Russia. Zelensky's agenda was definitely focusing on bringing peace to Ukraine and maintain conflict with Russia in a slow mode. So we saw the engagement of communication around normative format and everyday communication about prisoners exchange, which were quite successful in 2019, 2020. But definitely Ukraine didn't move as fast as and as far as Russia expected towards the implementation of Minsk agreement. So when we're talking about particular steps which Russia was expected from Ukraine towards the implementation of the Minsk agreement, we're talking about engagement separatist regions towards the global electoral process in Ukraine. It didn't happen. Ukraine introduced a decentralization. Ukraine would focusing on the everyday communication and demining of the region, and also stay strong in terms of the obtaining control of the Ukrainian border with Russia, and after then introducing the local election in the separatist region. So that model of communication was ended precisely 2020, 2021. We don't see that many of development, different part of development in between Russia and Ukraine. So why President Zelensky and how President Zelensky responded and actually changed his position in terms of maintaining peace in the eastern part of Ukraine and collaborating with Russian counterparts. So we saw the multiple initiatives to maintain cross division between separatist controlled region and maintain the everyday communication and improve a little bit. But we didn't see significant progress in this sphere because, first of all, the political agenda in Ukraine continued to change. And second, Russian counterpart was not responding to the messages from administration of Ukrainian president. Ukrainian leadership and Zelensky himself also transitioned significantly from the dominated peaceful agenda in 2019 to the much more reality-based analysis of the situation in the eastern part of Ukraine. I mentioned that President Zelensky, as a representative for Ukrainian political elite right now, obtained the massive support of Ukrainian population. And it's important to understand that this mobilization of public support of President Zelensky recently happened and continues to supply that significant resources for the internal messaging and also producing model of the possible communication with Russian counterpart. So another important mechanism of Ukrainian stability, and I would say instability as well, that was position of Ukrainian business elite and oligarchy. So the war affected Ukraine even before it started. In the end of January 2022, about 12.5 billion US dollars already removed from Ukrainian economy in fear of starting the war. Ukrainian oligarchy and business elite was actually in a very uncomfortable position from, I would say, summer 2021, when Ukrainian President Zelensky started to pressure tactics towards them. Pyotr Poroshenko, there was started investigation of his activities, previous president of Ukraine, and also one of the richest person in Ukraine. But at the same time, we also open investigation towards the Medvedchuk, oligarch of Ukraine, who represent opposition and pro-Russian ideas in Ukraine. For right now, we saw that there is a mild support of President Zelensky by Ukrainian oligarchs. I want to emphasize that Pyotr Poroshenko is directly supported and engaged in the territorial organization in Kiev and guarding the streets in Kiev and supporting the territorial unity and sovereignty of the country. The rest of the oligarchs are not that visible. Some of them, majority of them, remain outside of the Ukraine and sending their distant support. Ukrainian people united around the Ukrainian leader, for sure, and we see significant support, growing support of activities of Ukrainian president. How certain are you think that Ukraine will defeat Russian invasion? Strong belief among Ukrainian population all over West, Central, South, and East. The Green show us support for this idea that Ukraine will defeat Russian invasion. And we can see the numbers maintained between 70 to 80% based on different regions. And we also see that considering the modern development and sovereignty demands of the people all over the world, global Ukrainians become part of the all Ukrainian Protestant slavery, control in spreading the support and maintaining the support for Ukraine, conducting and influencing their local governments, engaging in fundraising and helping coordinating with activists. There are different sources, and Facebook show us multiple engagement and everyday activities of the diaspora groups all over the world. We also see that Ukrainian diplomatic activities support by many important international organizations. There is Security Council meeting recently. Few times we saw discussions on Ukraine. There is Emergency General Assembly of UN. A recent EU Parliament Assembly was conducted, and that much more should be done in terms of the engagement of and corresponding of the activism of transnational actors such as diaspora groups, international organizations, to maintain and raise the awareness and help Ukraine in this dire situation. I'll save much more information for question and answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Milana. We can move further with our next speaker. I would ask you to speak a bit louder so that everyone, sometimes the audio is not very good. So I would like all the speakers during Q&A and their presentation to speak a bit louder. So we continue with Dr. Paul Goode, who joined the Institute of European, Russian and Eurasian Studies last year as the Macmillan Chair of Russian Studies and Associate Professor. He is also the Editor-in-Chief of Communist and Post-Communist Studies and Associate Editor of Nationalities Papers. His research focuses on nationalism and authoritarianism in Russia and the post-Soviet space. Paul, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And Milana, could I ask you to stop sharing your screen, please, so I can put up some slides? Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd just like to thank very quickly the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and Professor Viju-Miljusevic for hosting this session. It's an important part of our Institute's public mission. And also, a big thanks to our contributing colleagues to the session and to all the participants for taking an active interest and concern in this ongoing war. I will try to keep my comments brief because this war has many fronts. But I want to start with the main observation, which is that this war was chosen by Russia. It was not inevitable. But now that it has begun, it is an existential matter for Putin's regime. And so I'm going to talk, I think, very briefly, first about sort of the foreign policy drivers of this conflict. And then I'm going to look both at elite and mass public levels. And there's the degrees of support for the war. Now, in terms of foreign policy, controlling Ukraine is seen as a key to the Kremlin's quest for recognition and identity. This includes also competing with the US and with NATO. Now, for Russia, security is framed largely in relation to post-Cold War grievances concerning the way that it perceives its international status. This includes, I think, significantly disagreements over whether Russia has gained or lost status, especially since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. Now, from the ultimatums that Putin made in December of 2021, last year, it became fairly clear that one of the significant goals, if not the main goal, of starting this entire crisis that led to the war was to, in effect, reset the international security order in Europe. But he has also been very clear that Putin does not accept Ukrainian statehood as legitimate. He does not accept Ukrainian nationhood as legitimate. And perhaps he considers both to be one of the most important historical injustices of the 20th century that needs to be corrected by forcibly changing the regime. So the proclaimed goals for Russia's invasion were denazification and decommunization. And there's no other way to interpret that than forcing regime change and possibly partition, even if occupation is not an explicitly proclaimed goal of Russia's invasion. Now, in domestic politics, the picture gets a little bit more complicated. And of course, domestic politics and foreign policy are often closely connected. In the past, Putin's foreign policy has been popular, much more popular than domestic policy. And this was especially the case following the annexation of Crimea, which saw Putin's personal approval ratings soaring to unprecedented levels for a long period of time. Now, it's hard to imagine in domestic politics in the midst of the current war that anything short of total victory in the ways that Russia defines it would not result in some sort of domestic political challenges, if not popular unrest. Unlike Lukashenko in Belarus, there is no neighboring Putin to rescue Putin when things go wrong. And this is, in a sense, a problem, and it's one that I believe the Kremlin is keenly aware of. Now, from what we have been able to glean, most of the political elite, as well as the economic elite in Russia, were not informed of and did not expect war. When they supported the recognition of the separatist Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, they did not believe that they were voting for war. Instead, likely those votes were interpreted as one of the Kremlin's semi-regular tests of loyalty. And this was vividly on display in the now infamous meeting of Putin's Security Council when he secured approval for the move to recognize the two separatist republics. Now, who knew? This is an open question. Reportedly, it was Defense Minister Shoigu and the head of the General Staff, Gerasimov, who were in on it. Very likely the head of Russia's security services or intelligence services. But even Putin's own chief of staff was in the dark. Now, data from Sharon Werning-Rivera's survey of Russian elites, which I've put on the slide here, shows that up until very recently, elite sentiment broadly favored preserving Ukraine's sovereignty. And so it's hard to imagine that there would be widespread support amongst the elite for going to war with Ukraine. Now, after war was declared, Putin's subordinates and enablers became hostage, both to the Kremlin and the international sanctions regime that has followed. Whether this has the effect of creating challenges or whether it forces the elite closer to Putin remains to be seen. Now, as the war has gone badly, Russia has clearly lost the information war, and it has started to ramp up suppression of domestic dissent. It started by denying that the so-called special operation was in fact a war, but now it has made words like war and invasion potentially equivalent to treason. And already independent media outlets like Echo Moskvy and the Dozh television channel have been forced off the air. But we have also started to see cracks in public support for the war at various levels of officialdom, and even among some of Russia's oligarchs, including Mikhail Friedman, Oleg Deripaska, and Anatoly Chubais. And this is something that we did not see in 2014. That suggests that not only is the sanctions regime far more severe than what followed in 2014, but also the degree of support in general for the invasion is nowhere near what it was for the annexation of Crimea. Now, an equally difficult question to address is whether or not the Russian public supports the war. Now, you have to make a caveat here, which is that public opinion data coming out of Russia now that the war has begun, is fundamentally unreliable, especially after the government has moved to impose felony penalties on dissent, especially by, for instance, expanding the definition of treason. However, pre-war polling by the Levada Center back in February showed about 45% of Russians considering war to be likely or unavoidable, while 49% considered it to be unlikely or impossible. So given a margin of error, we're talking about more or less sort of a certain degree of ambivalence amongst the Russian public about whether or not war was likely. But at the same time, about 60% held the US and NATO responsible for escalating tensions over Eastern Ukraine. That's what is shown here in this Levada Center figure. I'm sorry, I don't have the English translation here for you, but this figure here, 50% in November of 2021, 60% in February of 2022, believe that it was the US and the NATO countries that were responsible for escalating tensions over Eastern Ukraine. By contrast, Russians only held about 14 to 16% held Ukraine responsible, and only 3 to 4% held Russia responsible. So in other words, most people did not really have a firm position on whether or not war was likely, but if it did, they were ready to blame the US or NATO for it. Of course, there was also significant priming on state-controlled media and especially on television for war. And looking very quickly at the way that this sort of unfolds, What you see here is a content analysis drawing from transcripts from 5 different television channels in Russia for average or daily mentions, number of daily mentions of, on the left-hand side, the mentions of the 2 separatist republics, the Donetsk People's Republic or Luhansk People's Republic, and on the right side, mentions of genocide. And as you can see, there is a very clear escalation by the time that the decision to go to war was taken into account. But prior to that, it barely warranted mention on national television. And that indicates an instrumentalization, both of the People's Republics in the declared in Eastern Ukraine, as well as an instrumentalization of genocide in the national media as a justification for going to war. This is not something new. This has been something that is characteristic of Russia's past wars, and I'm sure we will hear a bit about this in a little bit from our other presenters. Of course, since the war began, there has been a media whitewashing of the war, which cannot even be called a war publicly. That, I would imagine, is probably unlikely to last. There is abundant evidence now that members of the elite refer to this as a war when they're talking with one another. More importantly, there are ample online channels for circulating information about the war, about what's really happening. One of those is Telegram. You might remember that Telegram is a social networking platform that the Russian government tried to ban and failed because it couldn't even get its own bureaucracy to stop using it. So it seems unlikely that Russia will be able to maintain an information blackout without simply turning off the internet. Now, that's not excluded. It is a possibility. And Russia has created this possibility under the term of the sovereign internet. An additional wild card here, I think, with regards to public opinion and public sentiment is memory politics. The annexation of Crimea was wrapped in Russia's memory of the Great Patriotic War, of the Second World War, and the symbolism of the Second World War. It will be extremely difficult for ordinary Russians to come to grips with the cognitive dissonance of recognizing that now the siege of Kyiv is being led by Russia as the aggressor, in contrast to Russia as the defenders, say, in the siege of Leningrad. It will be difficult for people to reconcile the visions of Russian soldiers being called occupiers and fascists on the streets of Kyiv and elsewhere throughout Ukraine. And that also can really strike at the heart of the regime's claims to legitimacy, which has made the memory of the Second World War and patriotism core to the way that Putin tries to legitimate his claim to power. So in sum, I would say the outcome in Russian domestic politics is really hard to predict. I mean, there is a reckoning coming for Putin's regime, both internationally and domestically. But ultimately, it's going to be ordinary Russians that will pay the price for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we're already starting to see some of these effects. The elite also will be paying the price in a very material sense going forward. And it will be up to both to decide what is the future of this war, because ultimately, only Russia can stop the war that Russia began. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We'll continue our discussion with Dr. Joan DeBardeleben, who is a Chancellor Professor in the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and is the co-director of the Scalton Center of European Studies. Her current research focuses on the EU-Eastern Partnership policy and EU-Russian relations, including the impact of the 2014 Ukraine crisis on the EU's Russia policy. She also conducts research on Russian regional elections. Joan, please go.
Okay, thank you very much, Crina. I'm going to focus in my comments on the European reaction. And there's a lot to cover here, but I'll try to do it quickly to save some time for questions. And I'm going to cover 3 basic issues. The first is, what is the European reaction? The second is, what are the major challenges for the European Union and for Europe? And the third has to do with some middle range or long-term implications. So the reaction, I think, has been dramatic from the European Union. And we place this in the context of the post-2014 policies of the European Union toward Russia and Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea, where sanctions were implemented, which are still in place. I mean, they were left in place right up until the moment of this war. But there was still the lack of any kind of real strategy in terms of how to deal with this situation with Russia, a reliance on fulfillment of the Minsk agreement, which was the agreement that was supposed to resolve the problem that, of course, was never implemented, and which Russia basically abrogated with the initiation of this war. So this these recent actions of Russia have really shifted the whole orientation to a much clearer, what I call a paradigm shift in the EU's relations with Russia and its overall stance in terms of the situation. I mean, how this will spin out in the long term depends on how the war comes out, of course. But it's unambiguous that the European Union is taking a very strong stance against the invasion of Ukraine. And it is changing its fundamental precept, which was based on an idea that through economic interdependence, which involves a lot of energy interdependence, that eventually Russia could be brought into the international sphere in a kind of positive way. Now that idea was really challenged by the Crimean annexation, but it's now basically been destroyed. And so Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security, sometimes called kind of the Foreign Minister of the EU, said on February 28th, relations with Russia will no longer be determined by trade. That sounds like a fairly pedestrian statement, but it's really a very radical statement in saying that the European Union can no longer rely on its basic kind of principle that through interdependence and trade relations that Russia could be brought, could kind of be brought into the international sphere in a positive way. And of course, that means there's got to be a shift in strategy. Now, what that long-term strategy will be, of course, has to be worked out. But the immediate implication is a broad range of actions that the EU has adopted. And I think the striking thing is 2 points about these measures. First, they've been adopted very quickly. And this is not easy for a union of 27 members, which previously had very divergent positions on Russia in the detail. And there were even some objections to continuing the Crimean sanctions. Now there's a very high degree of unity. We see Hungary being brought on board, which had been quite skeptical. We see other countries that had raised some questions about the previous sanctions also coming on board. And we see many member states taking unprecedented action, of course, most notably Germany, which has agreed to provide military aid to Ukraine, breaking a long time policy of not providing weaponry to conflict zones. We see very strong, the second really striking feature of this is that this not only the unity, but the speed, which kind of goes against, kind of the image we have of the EU as being kind of strapped by bureaucratic obstacles and cumbersome procedures. And the European Union has found ways to really overcome them and to get this unanimity to implement these measures. Now, I won't list all those measures. You probably read about them in the media, but they're rather similar to the measures that have been adopted by other allies, by the United States and by Canada, and most notably the agreement to put restrictions on the SWIFT payment system, which of course will greatly impact Europe itself. Now, I want to move on to the kinds of challenges that these measures present for the European Union, because we should not underestimate these. These are, we heard our foreign minister talk about the potential costs of some of our sanctions in Canada, but these pale in comparison to what the European Union is taking on and what will likely face. Of course, the first one is the migration issue, where there's an estimate that up to 5 to 7 million refugees will ultimately be entering mostly the European Union in the first instance. Because of this crisis we already have, I noticed on the CBC this morning, the figure was put at something above 800,000. And this is going on, as you've seen, in the media at a very rapid rate. This is very difficult to absorb. I mean, not just for Poland, but of course, these migrants will be distributed across the Union over a relatively quick period of time, I presume. And so this pales, this makes the previous refugee crisis that occurred a few years ago from the Middle East look like a much lesser challenge than this one. So how is the European Union going to deal with it? Well, there is now some discussion of possibly introducing or applying a temporary protection mechanism. Currently, Ukrainians can come into the EU without a visa because visa-free travel was granted a few years ago. But under that, it's very similar to the situation that Canadians would have traveling to the European Union. They can stay for 90 days within any 180-day period. And of course, that may lapse very quickly in the context of this conflict. If this temporary protection mechanism were actually implemented and it's available as an instrument, it requires a qualified majority vote to be of the members, which is a formula that the European Union has developed for such situations. It would provide protection up to 1 year, and initially for 1 year, and potentially up to 3 years for those who were considered to come under it, and would oblige member states to take on certain obligations in regard to those under this temporary protection mechanism, facilitating even things like residence permits, work permits, and other social welfare benefits. This would be very significant, and it has a number of other features, but we'll see. We have to watch. We have to see if the European Union takes that route. But obviously, this is going to be a huge demand on countries across the Union. And one of the interesting things about this is that some of those countries which were reluctant or refused to take their quota of asylum seekers in the 2015-2016 crisis are at the front lines now, namely Poland, Hungary, who are taking in these asylum seekers without hesitation and in really dramatic numbers. So it brings a kind of unity in terms of this asylum seeker issue. Before, this was an issue of dissension within the Union. Now it's an issue of unity. Second, of course, energy is a major issue with the German decision to not proceed with the certification of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which of course, was not yet in operation, so that didn't really affect current supply. But current supply is likely to be affected. And that means that Europe could suffer an energy shortage of natural gas or of oil coming from Russia. Russia's a major supplier of natural gas and oil to the European Union. It's hard to replace in quick order, but I think the European Union and Germany in particular are positioning themselves to deal with this potential problem by using reserves that they have on hand, by building new liquefied natural gas terminals, and also through cutting back energy use. Finally, another implication are just the tremendous costs that this will impose on Europe. And we have to remember that Europe has a 5% inflation rate already, but it's higher in some of those countries that are particularly affected, most notably the Baltic states and Poland. So this is going to raise an additional difficulty there. Now, in the medium to long term, there will be some questions on the agenda. First, enlargement. Will Ukraine be given a perspective for membership? It's asked for this immediately. That's been turned down by the European Union as an immediate possibility. But certainly as a longer term prospect, I think this could go back on the agenda. A second issue, how to cast policies toward the other Eastern countries. And finally, how to cast the whole debate about Europe's strategic autonomy. So I'll stop there and let our next speaker go on, so we'll have some time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, just 1 second. Thank you so much, John. So we'll end our starting comments with Dr. David Sichinava, who is lecturing at Carleton University Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. He also serves as research director at the Caucasus Research Resource Center in Georgia, a Tbilisi-based think tank. Dr. Sichinava's research focuses on elections and public opinion, housing and urban development in Eurasia, and geographies of conflict and displacement. David, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and many thanks to Professor Goode for organizing this panel, Professor Viju-Miljusevic for moderating, and Professors DeBardeleben and Nicolko for sharing their valuable opinion. First and foremost, I really want to share my condolences and sympathy with folks in Ukraine who are suffering from this war. For someone whose family had to flee due to war in Abkhazia in 1992, this is something I can't really understand. We sort of live in extraordinary times, to use an euphemism. So my goal today is to talk about similarities and difference between what's going on in Ukraine and what has happened in Georgia, the country. You might remember that in Russian foreign ministers, in famous articles that they published prior to the war, they demanded to block the perspective of NATO membership not only for Ukraine, but Georgia as well. When it comes to comparisons, it certainly is sort of a slippery slope. I've seen different assessments of whether the two cases can actually be connected or similar. And this has been done by very, very respected analysts. And I'm going to point out what they sort of think that are the key differences between the conflict in Ukraine and conflicts in Georgia, especially the 2008 war between Georgia and the Russian Federation. They say the 2008 war was sort of a Russia's reaction to Georgian or then time Georgian President Saakashvili's territorial revanchism to take back the breakaway territories. And on the other hand, what I can argue here is that there exists an opinion by the independent fact-finding commission that was procured by the European Union, which argues that while the shelling of the administrative center of South Ossetia by the Georgian forces marked the beginning of the large-scale armed conflict, yet it was the culmination, I'm quoting, point of a long period of increasing tensions, provocations, and incidents. So it was not a sort of a separate event. In other cases, we see that the larger context, perhaps a geopolitical dimension, is sort of downplayed. We can see that Georgia's territorial conflicts that emerged at the dawn of the Soviet Union sort of obtained a new meaning, another meaning from both practical and discursive perspectives for Russia, for Georgia, and for the greater world as well. Here I try to organize my thoughts with regard to connections between these two conflicts. First, the general situation. It is better to look at a greater scheme of things, which is foreign policy reorientation of Georgia. I'm trying to discuss right now what sort of led to the eruption of the 2008 war between Georgia and Russia. Well, Georgia and Russia did have uneasy relations from the very beginning, from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But in mid-1990s, Georgia was still sort of considered as a fairly close ally to Russia. But things started to unravel in late 1999 with the Second Chechen War, and prior to that with the sort of more assertive new president of the Russian Federation. Actually, during the Chechen campaign, Georgia's territory had been bombed several times when Russia sort of accused Georgia in supporting the Chechen separatists. And this sort of hinted the entire Georgian government to try to diversify its foreign policy portfolio. And unless, as many argue, that such reorientation actually happened following the Rose Revolution of 2003, it happened actually earlier. The then-time president, Eduard Shevardnadze, was really worried about Russian encroachment, especially after Putin's elections. And Georgia actually officially applied for NATO membership, stated about its intentions to become a NATO member in 2002 during the Prague NATO summit. Indeed, of course, the major turning point was the Rose Revolution, which saw Shevardnadze's government to go down, and new government of Mikhail Saakashvili had been elected, although initially Russia and Georgia sort of had some hopes to normalize their relations, but these hopes soon pretty much were not realized. And as some people argue, the Orange Revolution of Ukraine in 2005 was sort of also a turning point. In response to this, and in response to Georgia's sort of increasing wish to become closer to the West and to NATO, to the United States and to the European Union, of the word's sake, pressure from Russia actually started to mount. Russia certainly offered some nudges on various Georgian governments. For instance, this was in 2000, the year of 2000, the introduction of visa travel regime, which was, in fact, in theory, was related with the terrorist threat during the Chechen War. There was also the passportization procedure that was introduced for the residents of Georgia's breakaway regions in 2002, very similar to what happened in Donetsk and Luhansk districts, oblasts in Ukraine. There was a crisis in 2004 in South Ossetia, which certainly saw a kind of armed, low-intensity armed conflict, as well as in the following years, the relations unraveled further. For instance, there was a Russian Federation banned Georgian products imported to Russian Federation following the so-called spy scandal in 2006, and it also kicked out thousands of Georgian nationals from the Russian Federation. In parallel with this, Russia tried to further keep the de facto authorities of Abkhazia and South Ossetia closer. It was a military buildup in these territories during the whole period of 2000s. For instance, contrary to the 1999 Istanbul conference that sort of saw that the Russian military should leave all the territory of Georgia, we saw that the Goode military base in Abkhazia never was taken out of the territory. I also happened to watch a lot of Russian TV then, mid-2000s, and I could also sort of have kind of first-hand experience how this narrative towards Georgia has shifted. When it comes to specifically 2008 war, of course, there were factors that sort of led to this. Of course, this was the Bucharest summit that promised Georgia and Ukraine to become NATO members, and the Munich speech of President Putin. And yet another factor was sort of so-called the Kosovo precedent, when the Kosovo was aiming to unilaterally declare its own independence, and at the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that in response to this, to the declaration of independence, they had their own preparations for this fact. It's a really bad translation of Russian, but still, you get the point. And similar to Ukraine, prior to the 2008 war, there were military drills in the North Caucasus, so-called Caucasus 2008, in June and July, if not mistaken. While the Russian officials actually expressed their support for peaceful resolution, their actions sort of contradicted this. There were, for instance, Russian military forces involved in the rehabilitation of railways in Abkhazia, and so on and so forth. Of course, we could not deny that the Georgian government also exercised some sort of bellicose rhetoric and military buildup, and I cannot really go in the minds of the then-time Georgian leadership, but it was, to my opinion, it was a matter of time the conflict reached its hot stage. And finally, during the conflict, in the first days of the conflict, Russia actually accused Georgia in genocide, but importantly, these claims were rebuffed by the Taliavini fact-finding report. There were similar stories that we saw in Donbass in 2014 and 15 about crucified young boys, but these stories were never proven. And aftermath of the conflict, what we can say is that there was a large-scale displacement. I mean, Georgia, given that Georgia is a small country, it still had at least 25,000 people who cannot still go back to their houses in the territory of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, plus the people who fled the conflicts like me in early 1990s. There is the process of so-called borderization, which basically means that the Russian troops that are border troops that are concentrated on the border, they sort of try to kind of demarcate these borders and basically create this sense of instability and for the local peoples. And indeed, subsequent Georgian governments are sort of more reluctant towards Russia in their rhetoric and in their actions, which can be understandable because one of the main reasons in terms of the conflict indeed were the Georgian government's declared statements against the Russian Federation. But to highlight the geopolitical dimension of the conflict, I just want to read out a quote from a well-respected Russian international relations expert who wrote an article about the war. And he says, quote, "To the Russian teachers, the lesson cannot be clearer. Mind your geography. One cannot live next to a big country, such as Russia, and openly flout its interests. In plain language, this means forget about NATO membership, institutionalize your non-aligned status, and forbid any stationing of foreign forces in your territory." I think that this is very illustrative for Russian policies, and I think this is also what's going on in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you to all our panelists for your thoughtful introductory remarks. We did receive a number of questions, so for the sake of time, I will pose a few of them, and I would ask the panelists to answer whichever you think you can provide, an expert viewpoint on. And my hope is that we'll have 2 rounds of questions, so please keep your comments short so we can entertain some other questions. So I'll pose probably 4 at the beginning. One, I think it's related to the timing. The specific question refers to post-China's Olympics, but I would say more generally, why now that we see this invasion started? A second question is related to the bargaining power that Ukraine has at the negotiating table to deter Russia or stop the war. There is, of course, talk in the news about neutrality, citing Switzerland and Finland. Is that possible? Or is more turning to the EU, NATO the best option for Ukraine moving forward? The third question, and I think this came from various participants, is will this war spill over to the Baltic states especially, but I would add not only to other countries that are NATO countries, of course, and will this trigger a NATO response? I'm not sure how much you can provide answers to these kind of questions, but I'll pose. And the last one for this round is about the role of China and India. Why these emerging powers are not invited to regulate the West Russian skis with their own proposal, so not Western supported proposals. So I will end now for this round of questions. I think there are quite a few things that can be addressed here, and there are still some good questions that I would like to pose in a second round if we have the time. So whoever would like to start, Milana, I see you are unmuted. Would you like to start?
Yes.
And please speak a bit louder, Milana.
Okay, yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Felix, for the questions about bargaining and steps of the escalated conflict, the escalated situation in Ukraine. When the warfare started, and we're talking about conventional warfare, with multiple troops engaged in the air, artillery, and on the ground, it's really hard to finalize or even come to any agreement on both parts in the upcoming days. But that's what Ukrainian society is eager for, to stop the artillery attack, to stop the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So definitely there are some steps already taken, tactical steps in terms of the first round of negotiation between Russia and Ukraine, they were not successful, but at least both sides expressed their view. Right now, we're looking forward for the next one. The minimal requirement is definitely to reduce the pressure on Kharkiv, where we can see the people, civilians particular, in great danger. Second, we discussed the option of no-fly zone, but not for Ukraine entirely, but for the nuclear plant station, plants in Ukraine, because there's definitely security problem and safety problem for entire Europe and the world in general. Speaking of the bargaining power, what is Russian demands? I would like actually to engage my colleagues in discussion, because I want to hear how you interpreted these demands what Putin and his circle continuously repeat in terms of Ukraine. Talking about the joint NATO, Ukrainian President Zelensky open about looking for the possibilities of non-blocking status under specific guarantees from the leading powers in the world, speaking precisely of United States and Russia, and of course European Union. So those are major actors in this particular war, and we have to see that the perspective from the tactical negotiation, which is going on right now on the ground, to the potential peace negotiation, will include much more powerful players. Ukraine right now live day by day, and their strategic thinking is including the situation of non-block status for Ukraine, demilitarization in terms of the recent artillery attack on Russian attack. It's in fact happening because we can see that Ukrainian enthusiasm and public engagement in the war with Russia is incredibly high, but at the same time there's limited military resources in Ukraine. What and how we can interpret the denazification of Ukraine? I would like to hear some advice in here. If you're talking about removing President Zelensky from the office, it's very unlikely right now, because he has very strong public support and recognition, international recognition. If there is other possibilities for interpretation of this particular demand, it's definitely I would like to hear. Another important demand is recognition of Crimea. I don't know how far Ukraine will go and will even consider this particular demand. But again, we're talking about the multiple model negotiations, starting with Kharkiv, respond and continue to the further possible peace negotiation. Talking about is it any threat for Baltic states? Again, it's really hard to understand what's going on in one particular person's mind, and we know that there is a multiple changes appeared in the both strategies and tactics on both sides, Ukraine and Russia. And Russia also reflected on the international pressure very, very much. And again, we just in the 7th day of the war, which in terms of the conventional warfare is a very, very beginning of the war. But again, it's incredible pressure and incredible tragedy ongoing on the territory of Ukraine right now. I would like to some help maybe to
Paul, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah, just maybe some quick responses. I think the question about timing is one that has been sort of, I think, puzzling a lot of people, because in the past there have been very clear sort of domestic or international triggers that led to, you know, Russia's wars in the past, and in this case there wasn't a clear domestic trigger in Ukraine. So most of the explanations have tended to focus more on the Russian side of things. So what about Russian politics gives us some clue as to the timing. The domestic political explanations tend to suggest, well, one variant is that, you know, the Putin, or rather the collective Putin in the Kremlin, needed a quick war in order to bolster popularity. This has worked in the past, and it's entirely possible that the Kremlin was relying upon data that tragically overestimated the ease with which it would be able to carry out this campaign, and possibly also overestimated the extent of to which public support is consolidated behind Russia. I don't know that it really makes sense to say that the Kremlin felt weak. I think that Putin has consolidated control formally and informally in a way that has not been seen really since the Soviet era. And that can also contribute to overestimating and overreaching in important ways. That an alternative explanation is that Putin has so consolidated political control and is so unthreatened in domestic politics that he may feel unconstrained to pursue legacy projects. And for him, the ultimate legacy project is reversing the historical injustice from his perspective, right, of the separation of Russia and Ukraine. So I think that, you know, it may be some combination of those domestic political explanations, but there wasn't something that specifically primed, you know, as far as the relationship to the Olympics. I think it's, you know, it's not coincidental perhaps that, you know, the 2008 war, the 2014 annexation of Crimea, these all sort of came on the heels of Olympics, or in the case of 2008, actually at the very start of the Olympics in Beijing. One colleague of mine who is a sinologist pointed out that that Putin waited basically until the Winter Olympics were over this time before he began, which perhaps is a sign of the extent to which Russia is increasingly dependent upon China, that it did not want to sort of offend its allies. Another that has a bit more operational experience has suggested it was more a matter of waiting for more favorable ground conditions, that the ground was too soft to actually sort of launch an invasion. And so the wintering needed to deepen. And that may be sort of the sad truth, is that this has nothing to do with politics, and maybe everything to do with military conditions, because the decision had already been taken a long time ago. The question about Ukraine's bargaining power and neutrality, I think, is an important one. It's also, I think, now politically very volatile in Ukraine, in no small part because Russia's invasion has done something that Ukrainian leaders have not been able to do, which is to firmly consolidate and unify the Ukrainian population, both in favor of EU membership and NATO membership. You know, NATO meant about, you know, really prior to 2014. That's no longer the case, according to the data that's now coming out. Added to this, I think, is the perception, and I think it's probably a reasonable perception, that Russia has been negotiating in bad faith for months now, that it had long since made the decision that it was going to invade. And so everything has been smoke and mirrors up to this point. And even during the negotiations on Monday, there was no ceasefire. Russia continued attacking. And so the sad reality is that at this point, from the Ukrainian side, it's doubtful that anyone would take any security guarantees from Russia to be credible. And in that regard, I think neutrality is off the table, and without any credible guarantees, at least from the West, of Ukraine's security, and whether or not that will be forthcoming. And I see posts, you know, in the Q&A about no-fly zones, for instance. Understand that declaring a no-fly zone and enforcing a no-fly zone is essentially meaning that NATO gets directly involved in the conflict. And so that's not something that is separate from NATO getting directly involved in the war. And I guess that leads to the third question then, about whether or not this will spill over. And I can only say very briefly that this is something that everybody should be legitimately concerned about. And, you know, perhaps adding to this is that there was, you know, a video clip that was released out of Belarus, Lukashenko meeting with his war staff, and he actually showed a war map on national television that included actually an attack on Moldova in support of Transnistria. And so it could well be that this is part of a, you know, media operation that was designed to convey that possibility. I tend to think that autocrats often say the quiet part out loud when they don't mean to, and that it cannot be excluded that even if NATO doesn't want to get involved, the war may come to NATO, and that we do need to be prepared for that eventuality. And if Russia has backed out now effectively of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, there's nothing preventing NATO from bolstering defenses along the border.
David, Joan, would you like to add something? to these questions, or we can wait for the next round of questions?
Well, I could add a couple brief things. I think the other thing on the timing would be opportunity, that there may have been a perception that the West was weak at this point with the transition in Germany and Merkel no longer an actor to unify Europe, and also a perception that Biden might not be as strong as he's proven to be. And I think one shouldn't discount this. I find this more persuasive than some of the domestic politics explanations for the reasons that Paul has suggested. Turns out Russia was wrong on both counts. People were speculating about Germany even just a couple of weeks ago, and I think Germany, not to my surprise, but did, step up to the plate when push came to shove, even though it was reluctant to do some of these measures perhaps beforehand. On the issue of neutrality for Ukraine, I wondered whether Zelensky, in making that appeal to the European Union for immediate membership, was signaling that would not be given up. I mean, I could see that the possibility of this splitting of the NATO issue from the EU issue, because Russia has really focused on the NATO issue and hasn't really talked very much about the EU issue. And in my research, I found that the discussion with Russian, when one gets into this kind of Russian interlocutors, comes back to NATO, and whether there is room there for Ukraine to, this is all kind of hopeful thinking, I realize in the current context, but with the EU perspective being maintained and with the indications from the European Parliament, openness to supporting a membership perspective, candidate perspective, and some indications from other elements in the EU that this might possibly be something that could be now discussed, a membership perspective, or at least candidate status. We have to think optimistically in those kinds of terms. So as far as spillover, my thinking is along the line that Russia, of course, things happen that aren't intended or aren't predicted, but my concern would be that there could be spillover to some of the other Eastern Partnership countries, particularly Moldova or even Georgia. Probably not right now because Russia has too much on its plate, but that those countries not being in NATO are in the same position really as Ukraine in terms of their capacity to defend themselves. And of course, Moldova, I don't have a map here, but it's right next to Ukraine, and it's already Transnistria, that disputed area. Russia has a foothold there. Moldova has been ambivalent about, even though it's signed an association agreement with the EU and a free trade agreement, there's a lot of attraction to Russia and to Europe in that country. Now, I think that's shifting because the events in Ukraine are affecting that. Georgia very strongly pro-Western on the other hand. But I think that would be something to watch. And hopefully there will be no, Russia would not be so foolhardy and as to make any moves on any of the NATO countries, on the Baltics and Poland, and hopefully not on the other Eastern Partnership countries, but we need to keep a careful eye on that.
I will add a small note with regard to the kind of timing and the spillover effects. As for timing, it's sort of, if we look at both 2008 and 2022, they sort of came along with the other major international crisis, right? The 2008 financial crisis and the 2022, well, we are still living in the era of COVID. And therefore, I think that's, of course, that might not be a defining factor. They could be so-called false friends, but still, we can see that both of these conflicts are happening along with the major international crisis. And with regard to a spillover, I think I would agree with Professor DeBardeleben in this, that perhaps those countries who are already NATO members are not that, are less vulnerable towards, let's say, further Russia incursion, but the countries that are similar to Moldova or Georgia are kind of are in the worst position in this situation. And well, while I don't have like most recent public opinion data on Georgia or Moldova, I would see that things might have changed in the popular perception with regard to European Union and NATO membership. Unfortunately, I will have them in a couple of days, but not now. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 10 more minutes, so I'll pose some questions. We received lots of questions. I'm sorry for the ones that we cannot entertain for the sake of time. I'll pose some, and please pick the ones that you think you have the expertise to answer. There are some to specific people, and I would say I'll start, David, with you, because you ended in terms of neighboring countries that have frozen conflicts. What do you imagine their reactions are to the Ukrainian invasion? Paul, can you clarify what you mean by Putin rejects Ukraine's statehood and nationhood, and why? Joan, there are a number of questions related to the European Union and related to the idea that trade is not necessarily the way to keep the relation going. So it is clear that this policy was not enough, but do you think completely abandoning it will backfire? And if Russia lacks any interdependence with the EU and the West as a whole, what does it have to lose from proceeding with further incursions and other actions that the West opposes? And also to Europe, with the imminent energy crisis, do you think that Turkey will now become an important player for the EU? Milana, what do you think will be the exit, and Paul, what would be the exit strategy for Russia to end the war here? And I assume a question was here related to what's the end game? Would the government supported by Russia will be supported by the Ukrainian citizens in the long term? I think there is an interesting question related to the Arctic, and Russia holds the chairship of the Arctic Council right now. How do you see the current situation in Ukraine impacting the Arctic cooperation in the near future? And I will end by asking, I think there were many questions on the West Fault, and what's your opinion on that? And when I'm talking about West Fault, the question relates to placing missiles closer to Russia, promising NATO membership to the Ukraine, placing militaries around Russia in the country. So how do you assess NATO's fault in this current crisis? And there are so many other questions, but unfortunately, it's hard to entertain all of them. So please provide some comments on these questions, whoever would like to start. David, I started with you, so yes.
Sure. Yeah, I will be quick because I can say about like 2 questions. In terms of reactions from, let's say, countries in the immediate neighborhood, right, who are not EU and NATO members, I think it was terrifying for all of them, especially given the fact that both Moldova and, to a certain extent, Georgia both have more Western-leaning governments, despite all the discussions whether they are truly Western-leaning or not. I can say about Georgia that they had an appeasement strategy towards Russia over time, but I mean, still they signed the association agreements, they established this free travel regime, and EU, especially EU, is really involved in Georgia, similar to Moldova. But of course, the reactions were quite ambiguous, and to a certain extent, I could see why, let's say, government of Georgia, for instance, or Moldova, were kind of reluctant to, in their expressions of support towards Ukraine, and it definitely kind of had a backlash within especially within the Georgian society. So there were protest rallies against them, kind of government's policies towards Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And basically, just a couple of maybe half an hour, we saw news that the Georgian government will be applying will present its membership request towards the European Union, so which is an interesting development. As for the West's fault, I mean, I think it's kind of it's a hard question because there sort of was a fundamental misunderstanding of what Russia wanted and what the West wanted, so we sort of ended up with this situation. Thank you.
John, please go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it on. Okay. So on the trade thing, I wasn't meaning to imply that trade with Russia would be ended, but I think we have to listen to what Borrell said closely. He said relations with Russia will no longer be determined by trade. And that means that this may be kind of a naivete or a false hope that that kind of economic basis could really provide the basis of a fundamental transformation in Russia has to be questioned, and one has to take a bit more geopolitically savvy, which is something the EU is learning overall. The EU has been reluctant to act geopolitically, and I think many events are teaching the EU that it can't be avoided, that there are geopolitical implications of the EU's actions and of the actions of other actors, and so those things have to be taken into account. Is it the West's fault? Well, I mean, you know, the problem is that one can make the point that maybe there were some mistakes made, misunderstandings. The abrogation of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, I think in 2003, was a very, very important turning point in terms of disrupting the stability of the strategic balance in Europe from the Russian perspective. We could discuss NATO enlargement. It's difficult really to come to a firm conclusion on that, or even to NATO's role, but none of that justifies this reaction. I mean, I think that's really the point, that this reaction violates all kinds of norms of ethics, of international law, of agreements that were made, of humanity. And so even if one were to say, okay, there's, you know, legitimate security concerns that Russia may have had, this is not a legitimate way to deal with them. And I think that's really what this comes down to at the end of the day. Now, whether we're past the point where we can talk calmly about those other issues, unfortunately, and that's Russia has created a self-fulfilling prophecy by activating NATO against it. And that's why these actions are fundamentally counterproductive and are not, I can see no way they'll further the long-term security interests of Russia. So whatever we can debate the other question, but as far as its relationship to this, I think that's the final point. On the Arctic, it's been an area where there has been relatively good cooperation. I imagine that will suffer. And I just can't see that continuing in this particular time period. That's very unfortunate because it was one of the few areas where there was good constructive cooperation.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to be brief because I know time is very short. First, with regards to Putin's positions on Ukrainian statehood and nationhood, I would just refer you to the comments that he made when declaring war in the first place, and then also the lengthy 5,000-word essay that he published has been widely translated into English as well last summer, and also widely discredited by professional historians about Ukraine and its people. As far as the exit strategy goes, I should mention, I misspoke earlier. I mentioned decommunization as one of Russia's goals. Actually, it's demilitarization and denazification, although Putin did joke about decommunization. So those are sort of bound up, at least in the discourse. I do not think a puppet regime would be accepted or supported by Ukrainian citizens. Nothing about the resistance so far has suggested otherwise, although that was clearly an expectation, I think, on the part of Russia. The challenge is, what can Russia sell that's short of total victory in the way that is defined it, that would not significantly impact the ways that Putin's own personal power within Russia domestically, is in somehow, weakened or infringed. And I think that's an issue. I mean, I think that an exit strategy that's short of the proclaimed goals will probably then involve domestic purges, as there will be political blowback that will need to be curtailed, and that could mean not just ramping up suppression of dissent domestically, but also potentially sort of some purging of the ranks, as well as scapegoats are sought. And probably, so the fallback position minimally for that would make that possible would involve some form of partitioning Ukraine forcefully and trying to turn all of Ukraine effectively into a frozen conflict. But I think still that would be viewed very widely within Russia as a failure. And then finally, just about the West role, I don't have a lot to add to what my colleagues have already sort of said. I agree completely with how they've described it. Sovereign states made decisions to join NATO, and they had good reasons to do so. I do think there perhaps were some mistakes at the start of the 1990s that could have avoided in some ways an unfortunate trajectory of relations between NATO and Russia. And one of the simplest ways to avoid that might have been, for instance, just to call NATO something else. But ultimately, nothing about what has happened since then justifies a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And Russia is not encircled by NATO. It was not an existential threat before the war. It's Russia's invasion that has made the war an existential threat to Russia.
Thank you. And Milana?
Yes, thank you, Crina. Thank you so much. So the question is a tough one. If Russia overruns Ukraine, what's going to happen? So there are scenarios we exercising every day, and they're changing completely on day-by-day phases as well. So we were considering first one is a fast escalation of the ground troops of Russia, and then they're actually not staying on the territory of Ukraine, but receive some concessions from Ukraine in terms of non-NATO status and maybe a corridor to Crimea, South corridor to Crimea. Again, that was one scenario we originally look at and considered to be possible for this particular military aggression of Russia. Then it has been changed when we see that a significant military force moved towards Kiev. Again, now we see the changing the scenario with Ukraine with a new government posed by Russia, particularly of the left bank of the Dnieper towards the Russian territory, might be something what is the plan for Russian Federation right now. I would say there is a tactical and strategic balance on both sides right now, and then it's a timing game. Unfortunately, it's in favor of Ukraine because Ukraine is putting all the force, all the stamina and all the trust in the people, in the army, and in global support right now, and giving day by day on the day-by-day basis. So I would not consider that Russia will have strength to occupy entire one of the largest country in Europe, and a country of 42 million people even in there. I probably have some maximums of scenarios of occupying the left bank up to the left bank of Dnipro. Is it any possible exit for Russia, or applicable exit for Russia, which might be considered as a determination of the war? In this case, we can see that some concessions should be made, both by Ukraine and both by NATO and the European Union. Again, parties will require moderation from the major players, and the United States at one point will be in negotiation, but it's way too early. Right now, we're talking about tactical negotiation of just down a little bit of fire and remove the civilian population from the targeting zone of Kharkiv, particularly and south of Ukraine and Kiev. So it's long. In terms of the scenarios, there's definitely this game for both parts, Ukraine and Russia. It's a long-term game.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of our time. I would like to thank our panelists for, first of all, for being able to go beyond their emotions and personal situations and provide an analytical view that we can all at least try to understand better what's going on and what would be the future. And I would like to thank everyone that joined us today and for your insightful questions. We will post the recording of this roundtable on the Eurus Web YouTube channel. So if in case you lost any part of the presentation, you will be able to access it in the next couple of days. Have a good day, and I hope that the situation will, let's just hope together that the situation will be better in the next few days. Have a good day. Bye.